Sometimes, two nations speak not in words, but in fire and shadow. Iran and Israel are locked in a silent storm, and what just unfolded could mark the beginning of something far more dangerous. We'll unravel every twist, every threat, but trust me, what I share at the end, that's the most chilling part. Stay with me. In the grand, often turbulent chronicle of nations, there exist enmities so deeply rooted, so entangled in the soil of history, ideology, and perceived existential threat that they smolder for decades, punctuated by shadow skirmishes and fiery rhetoric, always threatening to erupt into open conflagration. Such is the tragic and complex relationship between Iran and Israel, two powers occupying a region that has for millennia been a crossroads of civilizations and, too often, a battlefield. To understand what is happening now, the missiles that cleave the night sky, the targeted strikes on sensitive facilities, the agonizing human cost, we must first acknowledge that this is not a sudden storm. It is rather the culmination of a long, bitter winter, a shadow war that has been waged with varying intensity since the seismic shift of Iran's 1979 Islamic Revolution. That revolution didn't just transform Iran internally, it radically reconfigured the geopolitical landscape of the Middle East, setting Tehran on a collision course with an Israel that viewed this new, ideologically fervent Islamic Republic as a profound and implacable adversary. For over 4 decades, this conflict has largely played out in the covert realms. Sophisticated cyber attacks, like the infamous Stuxnet worm that targeted Iran's nuclear centrifuges, precision assassinations attributed to Mossad, aimed at crippling scientific and military leadership, and the relentless fostering and arming of proxy forces. Groups like Hezbollah in Lebanon and Hamas in Palestine became instruments in this wider struggle, allowing Iran to project power and exert pressure on Israel's borders without necessarily engaging in direct state-on-state warfare. This intricate, deadly game of thrust and parry, fought in the digital ether, in clandestine meeting rooms, and through the tragic medium of regional militias, has defined their relationship, each incident adding another layer of mistrust, another grievance to the already heavy burden of animosity. The world watched, often with trepidation, as these two formidable powers circled each other, their every move carrying the potential for wider, more devastating escalation. This long, shadowy preamble is crucial, for the fires we see today are fueled by the embers of these past confrontations. Fractured calm. The fragile, often illusory calm that periodically settled over this decades-long shadow war was violently shattered, or, perhaps more accurately, the conflict merely surged into a more visible and brutal phase, following the events of October 2023. The devastating attack on Israel by Hamas, a group Iran has long backed and armed as part of its axis of resistance, served as a profound catalyst, a strategic breakpoint that irrevocably altered the intensity and the rules of engagement. From Israel's perspective, Iran's support for this proxy-driven assault was not merely indirect complicity, but a direct enabling of an existential threat. The response was predictably fierce, with Israel intensifying its covert campaign against Iranian assets and interests, a clear signal that the previous parameters of the shadow war were no longer considered sufficient. The animosity, once primarily waged through intermediaries and clandestine operations, began to bleed more overtly into direct state-level calculations and preparations. This escalating tension reached a dramatic and unprecedented climax on June 13, 2025. On this day, Israel, feeling perhaps that the covert war was failing to deter or sufficiently degrade its adversary's capabilities, launched a bold and expansive aerial offensive codenamed Operation Rising Lion. This was not a subtle, deniable strike. It was a clear, unambiguous military operation targeting the very heart of Iranian nuclear and military infrastructure. Top Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps (IRGC) commanders and leading nuclear scientists were reportedly among the casualties, a devastating blow to Iran's strategic capabilities and intellectual capital. Furthermore, Israel is said to have employed sophisticated Mossad-driven drone sabotage to systematically disable Iranian air defenses, paving the way for its warplanes and missiles. This audacious operation represented a fundamental shift from shadow to open warfare, a crossing of a perilous Rubicon from which there would be no easy return. The intent was clear: to inflict significant damage, to send an unmistakable message of resolve, and perhaps to fundamentally alter Iran's strategic trajectory by force. The lion had indeed risen, and its roar echoed ominously across a region now bracing for an inevitable and likely furious Iranian response. Retaliatory fury. The response from Tehran to Operation Rising Lion was as predictable as it was ferocious. Iran, reeling from the audacious Israeli strikes on its nuclear and military nerve centers and the targeted killings of key personnel, unleashed a barrage of missile and drone attacks aimed at Israeli territory. This was not a token gesture of defiance, but a significant retaliatory salvo, demonstrating both capability and intent. Reports indicate that hundreds of Iranian missiles, including sophisticated systems like the Fatah hypersonic missile and the long-range Imad ballistic missile, alongside a multitude of attack drones, were launched. While Israel's multi-layered air defense systems, including the vaunted Iron Dome and David's Sling, successfully intercepted many of these incoming projectiles, the sheer volume of the assault meant that some inevitably broke through. Civilian zones in major Israeli cities, including Tel Aviv and Beersheba, were reportedly hit, causing casualties and sowing panic. This marked a terrifying new phase: direct state-on-state missile exchanges targeting population centers, a scenario long feared but now tragically realized. The Iranian retaliation was not merely a military response, it was a deeply symbolic act, intended to show its own populace and its regional adversaries that it would not, and could not, absorb such a significant attack on its sovereignty without a forceful answer. Each missile launched carried a message of retribution, a refusal to be cowed. This exchange, however, did not occur in a vacuum. The international community watched with bated breath, and global powers began to weigh their own strategic interests and potential involvement. The cycle of attack and counterattack, a hallmark of this protracted conflict, had now reached a terrifying new velocity, with both sides demonstrating a willingness to escalate in ways that directly impacted civilian lives and risked dragging the entire region into a much wider, more devastating conflagration. The skies over the Middle East, once filled with the whispers of covert operations, now thundered with the undeniable roar of open war. Widening vortex. The conflict, initially focused on the direct confrontation between Iran and Israel, soon spiraled outwards, drawing in other powerful actors and further destabilizing an already fragile region. A pivotal moment occurred on June 22, when the United States, which had long provided tacit and overt support to Israel, entered the fray directly and overtly. American forces, employing powerful bunker-buster bombs and precision cruise missiles, struck three key Iranian nuclear facilities: Fordo, Isfahan, and Natanz. These were sites that had been at the heart of international concerns and negotiations for years, facilities buried deep underground and heavily fortified. The American intervention was a clear and unambiguous signal of direct backing for Israel's campaign, moving Washington from a position of ally and supplier to active co-belligerent in the offensive against Iran's nuclear infrastructure. This dramatically raised the stakes, transforming the conflict into a much broader confrontation with potentially global implications. The scope of the Israeli strikes themselves had already been extensive, targeting not just overtly military and nuclear sites, but also government buildings and even symbolic locations, such as Evin Prison in Tehran, notorious for holding political prisoners. The human cost of this escalating war began to mount alarmingly. Reports indicate that Iran suffered between 600 and 950 lives lost, a significant portion of whom were civilians caught in the crossfire or collateral damage of strikes on urban or dual-use facilities. Israel, despite its sophisticated defenses, also incurred casualties, with over 25 deaths reported and hundreds of injuries from the Iranian missile barrages. Beyond the immediate casualties, a profound humanitarian crisis began to unfold, with reports of over 100,000 people fleeing the Iranian capital, Tehran, fearing further strikes and societal breakdown. Civilian infrastructure, power grids, communication networks, transportation hubs became increasingly vulnerable, targeted either directly or as a consequence of wider attacks, exacerbating the suffering of ordinary people caught in this devastating vortex of violence. The war was no longer a contained duel but a spreading inferno, threatening to consume all in its path. Fraying alliances. A significant and perhaps unexpected strategic development in this rapidly escalating conflict has been the apparent proxy fatigue exhibited by Iran's traditional regional allies. The so-called Axis of Resistance, a network of militant groups including Hezbollah in Lebanon, Hamas in Palestine, and the Houthi movement in Yemen, all long cultivated and supported by Tehran, began to show signs of pulling back from unreserved engagement. This hesitancy stemmed from a confluence of factors: the sheer ferocity and effectiveness of Israeli and now American strikes, the significant losses these groups had themselves sustained in previous rounds of conflict, particularly Hamas since October 2023, and Hezbollah in skirmishes along Israel's northern border, and growing internal pressures within their own constituencies. For these proxies, the cost of unwavering loyalty to Iran in a full-blown direct confrontation with Israel and the United States started to appear prohibitively high. There were reports of strategic setbacks and resource depletion among these groups, blunting Iran's ability to significantly escalate the conflict or open multiple, debilitating fronts against Israel via these traditional channels. While rhetorical support for Iran undoubtedly continued, the willingness or capacity to translate that into decisive, coordinated military action seemed to diminish. This development represented a critical blow to Iran's long-standing strategy of asymmetric warfare, which relied heavily on these proxy forces to project power, bog down adversaries, and create a multi-front threat. If the pillars of this axis were indeed weakening or becoming more cautious, it would force Tehran to rely more heavily on its own conventional military capabilities, which, while formidable in certain areas like missile technology, were now facing the combined might of Israel and direct American intervention. This proxy fatigue suggests that the intense pressure being applied was not only impacting Iran directly, but also fraying the edges of its carefully constructed regional alliance network, potentially isolating Tehran and limiting its options for sustained broad-spectrum retaliation. The game of leverage through others appeared to be yielding diminishing returns under the unbearable weight of open, high-intensity warfare. Strategic calculus. Dissecting the strategic motivations and goals of the primary belligerents reveals a complex interplay of existential concerns, regional ambitions, and the cold logic of military capability. For Israel, the objectives of Operation Rising Lion and the ensuing campaign, now directly supported by the United States, appear multifaceted and profoundly ambitious. The primary publicly stated goal is the destruction or severe degradation of Iran's nuclear capabilities, an issue that Israeli leadership has long described as an intolerable existential threat. Beyond this, there is a clear intent to diminish Iran's potent missile power, which poses a direct and constant danger to Israeli population centers and critical infrastructure. The strikes on IRGC commanders and military installations are aimed at disrupting command and control and weakening Iran's capacity to project conventional force. Furthermore, underlying these military objectives, some analysts suggest a more audacious, though perhaps less overtly stated goal, to destabilize the Iranian regime itself, possibly hoping that sustained military and economic pressure, coupled with internal discontent, could lead to its overthrow. The extensive use of Mossad-led sabotage operations aimed at degrading Iran's air defenses and disrupting its sensitive programs from within underscores a commitment to a multi-layered offensive strategy, combining overt military power with sophisticated covert action. On the other side, Iran's strategic position is one of forced reaction and determined, if increasingly constrained, resistance. Its primary response has been the launching of massive missile salvos against Israel, a clear demonstration of its will to retaliate and inflict pain. Beyond direct strikes, Iran has threatened military supply lines to Israel, seeking to disrupt the logistical support crucial for sustaining a prolonged offensive. Crucially, Tehran is also actively positioning itself with powerful international allies, most notably Russia, seeking diplomatic cover, potential military assistance, or at least a counterweight to American influence. However, despite its defiant posture and continued retaliatory efforts, Iran is undeniably suffering significant strategic setbacks, from the damage to its critical infrastructure and the loss of key personnel, to the reported depletion of resources and the emerging fatigue among its regional proxies. The strategic calculus for both sides is a grim equation of risk, resolve, and diminishing returns. Global ripples. The escalating war between Iran and Israel, now overtly involving the United States, is not a localized conflict contained within well-defined borders. Its repercussions are sending dangerous ripples across the entire Middle East, and indeed, the globe. The strikes are not confined to Iranian and Israeli territory. The vortex of violence has spilled over into neighboring countries, with reports of engagements or related incidents in Iraq and Syria, where Iranian-backed militias and IRGC elements have long operated. In Lebanon, the traditional domain of Hezbollah. In Yemen, home to the Houthi movement, and across the vital Gulf water straits, particularly the Strait of Hormuz. Iran's standing threat to close or disrupt shipping through Hormuz, a conduit for approximately 20% of global oil supplies, hangs like a sword of Damocles over the world economy. Any such action would inevitably trigger a global energy crisis, sending prices skyrocketing and potentially plunging already fragile economies into recession. The role of the United States in this conflict has become a subject of intense international debate. By striking Iranian nuclear sites directly, Washington has significantly deepened its military involvement, moving beyond its traditional role as Israel's primary arms supplier and strategic partner to become an active combatant against Iran. While this direct intervention provides crucial advanced weaponry, logistics, and a powerful demonstration of solidarity with Israel, analysts question its long-term efficacy and the inherent risks of such deep entanglement. Does direct American military action ultimately serve long-term U.S. goals in the region, or does it merely inflame tensions, draw in other adversaries, and make a diplomatic resolution even more elusive? The mounting domestic and international pressure for de-escalation reflects a widespread fear that the conflict is rapidly approaching a point of no return. The sheer human cost and the potential for widespread upheaval are sources of grave global concern, The targeting of civilian infrastructure, whether intentional or as collateral damage, and the mass displacement of populations, as seen with the exodus from Tehran, signal a looming humanitarian catastrophe if the fighting continues to escalate, further underscoring the profound and perilous global implications of this rapidly intensifying war. Crossroads ahead. As this direct and brutal phase of the Iran-Israel war unfolds, the crucial question on every observer's mind is, what happens next? Several critical factors will likely determine the trajectory and intensity of the conflict in the coming weeks and months. Iran's missile capacity will be a key determinant of the war's pace. While Tehran possesses a formidable arsenal, its ability to sustain high-volume missile strikes against Israel, particularly in the face of concerted Israeli and American efforts to degrade its launch capabilities and stockpiles, will be severely tested. The remaining inventory of missiles and the resilience of its production and launch infrastructure will dictate how long Iran can maintain its current retaliatory posture. Another pivotal variable is the future role of the United States. Will Washington choose to dig in, deepening its military commitment to degrading Iran's capabilities and potentially supporting regime change, or will it, under domestic and international pressure, seek to step back, prioritizing de-escalation and a return to some form of diplomatic engagement? Continued deep U.S. involvement could further deter Iran or force concessions, but it also carries the significant risk of drawing in other adversaries, such as Russia or China, more directly on Iran's side, potentially transforming a regional conflict into a broader great power confrontation. The most fundamental question, however, may lie in the enduring tension between military strategy and the search for a political solution. Despite potential battlefield gains and the successful degradation of Iranian assets, many experts warn that Israel, even with full American backing, may fail to completely eliminate Iran's deeply embedded nuclear program or its ideological commitment to regional influence through military means alone. The Iranian nuclear program, dispersed and in many cases hardened, has proven resilient over decades. True, lasting security, many argue, cannot be achieved solely through bombs and sabotage. It ultimately requires a viable political framework, however difficult that may be to envision amidst the current carnage. The strategic crossroads is clear. Will the path chosen be one of unrelenting military pressure, risking ever wider war, or will there be a realization that, eventually, some form of dialogue, however fraught, must be pursued to avert an even greater catastrophe? The current conflict between Iran and Israel, now unequivocally involving direct American military action, represents the most perilous escalation since the 1979 revolution. The overt airstrikes, the relentless missile exchanges, and the devastating impact on civilian populations have stripped away the last vestiges of the shadow war, plunging the region into a period of acute crisis. Israel, with powerful U.S. support, is systematically attempting to dismantle Iran's nuclear infrastructure, curtail its missile capabilities, and disrupt its security networks. Iran, while retaliating with significant force, shows signs of strain, grappling with internal pressures, resource limitations, and the apparent hesitancy of its traditional regional allies. The immediate future remains profoundly uncertain. Whether this brutal confrontation escalates into a full-blown regional inferno, drawing in more actors and risking global economic and political stability, or whether it can be contained by strategic fatigue, dwindling resources, or an eventual desperate turn towards diplomacy, is a question that hangs heavy over a world watching with profound apprehension. The echoes of past enmities have now become the thunder of present war, and the path back to any semblance of peace appears longer and more treacherous than ever before. In the stark illumination of exploding ordnance and the cries of the afflicted, The intricate tapestry of human history reveals its most somber threads. The animosities that fuel such conflicts are often generations in the making, woven from grievance, fear, and the unyielding conviction of righteousness. Yet, even as the storm rages, the enduring human spirit holds within it the capacity for reflection, for empathy, and for the courageous belief that even the deepest divides can, one day, be bridged. The path ahead is fraught with peril, but the pursuit of understanding, the unwavering commitment to seek peaceful resolutions even when they seem impossible, remains the most profound obligation we owe to ourselves and to the generations who will inherit the world we shape today.